Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today for our webinar organized as part of a series of webinars in cooperation with the European Environmental Bureau and organized by Switch Asia, an EU-funded program. Today's webinar is about the EU's packaging and packaging waste regulation. So we will dive into this topic together. And good morning. Thank you for that message. Maybe we can look at the housekeeping rules together for this webinar as people join. Excellent. Thank you. So we're bringing up the presentation as you join. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And as you see, and as you experience, your microphones are muted to avoid any audio interference. And you can ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. You can ask them live, and then even if it's while the panel is happening, then we can take them when it will be time for Q&A, and you will receive the presentation at the end of this webinar. You will also receive a recording of the webinar, and you can ask any further questions by email. You're most welcome to if you have questions you'd like us to follow up on. So with no further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Dr. Zenaida Fedeva, team leader of the Switch Asia Policy Support Component, to introduce this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Elodie, and good morning, good afternoon in Europe, dear colleagues. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar dedicated to the EU packaging and waste regulation organized by the Switch Asia Policy Support Component Program and the European Environmental Bureau, with which we are running this webinar as part of this series dedicated to various policies which are important for Europe and also have implication for the region in Asia. So we are keeping it really as an interactive series of the discussions. You can find quite a lot of information on this on our website. And maybe while I'm greeting you all, Elodie, you could put the link to the previous webinars, which also would be useful in the context of this conversation. We all know that today is really a time of increasing urgency and also increasing opportunity. The European Union's adoption of the packaging and packaging waste regulation earlier this year marks a very serious step towards reducing the environmental impact of packaging, and it really introduces legally binding measures to promote prevention and reuse and recyclability of materials, and also it aims to reduce waste and dependency on virgin resources. This is not just a European agenda. We know that it signals a broader shift in how economies in Asia, among other regions, manage materials and design responsibility into products from the outset, from design and from the upstream along the supply chain. But of course, this is not a one-way exchange. While we gather today here to explore the EU experience and the implications of this specific regulation, it's also important to recognize that innovations and lessons emerging here in Asia, and we as Switch Asia program are actually based in Asia and working with 42 countries in Asia, Middle Eastern countries, and in the Pacific. And across the region here, countries are piloting systems for reusable packaging. Countries are developing policies to reduce single-use plastics, to invest in local solutions that often achieve remarkable impact, sometimes with fewer resources and more complex, and also in a more complex context. Asian experiences are not only valuable, they are critical. we know we are dealing with a region which is industrially very powerful. And those experiences really show how circularity can be rooted in nationally appropriate laws, but also in informal systems, in social enterprises, in consumer culture, which shows some interesting experiments. So they remind us, these Asian experiences, that progress doesn't always begin with legislation, and it can also be starting with practical innovations on the ground. And today's dialogue should really, therefore, be seen as mutual learning. The panel today is really very interesting and brings together a diverse group of experts who collectively offer insights into this global local interaction, which I'm talking about, from those we will hear who involved in shaping EU legislation, to those which from civil society advocates, to private sector innovators in Asia. And their combined perspective will help us to understand how not only what is changing, but also how to respond and to co-create future-ready systems. At Switch Asia, we see our role as a bridge, and therefore this combined perspective of Asia and Europe is particularly encouraged. And this bridge is seen as supporting regional cooperation, amplifying local solutions, creating space for policy and practice, and for those to align. Today's webinar, as I mentioned at the beginning, is one of many steps on this journey. And we, of course, thank you in advance for joining us today, and hope this discussion sparks new thinking, new partnerships, new momentum for sustainable packaging system in both Asia and Europe. Thank you very much. Look forward to be part of the exchange. Over to you, Elodie.
Thank you so much, Zenaida. I would now like to walk us through a little bit the agenda so that attendees are aware of what is coming, and then I will give the floor to Marco. So following the introduction of Dr. Zenaida Fadeva, Mr. Marco Musso, Deputy Policy Manager for Circular Economy at the European Environmental Bureau, will present to us the EU Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation. Marco, I will introduce him briefly, and then his presentation will start. Marco works on circular economy, but also on green fiscal reform. He's leading EEB's work on fiscal, financial, and economic instruments for the green transition. And he's been working prior to joining EEB on circular economy policies for the European Organization for Packaging and the Environment, as well as in the European Parliament. So he understands perfectly the intricacies of EU legislation. So now I would like to pass the floor to Marco so he can guide us through this. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Elodie. Thank you, Elodie, for introduction, and good morning, everyone. And yes, I'll have the pleasure to present in the next 15-20 minutes the key element of the packaging and packaging waste regulation. So then we will be able to have the discussion on mutual learnings from this. Next slides, please. And the starting point is perhaps to understand why the European Union had the need to improve its rules to deal with packaging and packaging waste. And the starting point is looking at the reality, the environmental reality in Europe, which is one of a single-use packaging waste crisis. And looking at the numbers, the situation when this regulation was imagined, is that over the last 10 years, European Union saw a 20% increase in the amount of packaging waste, and that was projected to grow of another 19% by 2030. And an interesting or worrying element about this growth is that the growth in waste had progressed much faster than the growth of the overall economy, so the growth of GDP, kind of showing that the packaging practice in the European Union have actually become more and more wasteful over the time. With a record per capita generation of packaging waste of over 188 kilos in 2021, that was kind of the record for packaging waste generation in the European Union, which marked a growth of 6% in the generation of packaging waste in just 1 year. Imagine that is around 11 kilos more waste per person. In terms of the material composition, because this could be interesting, there could also be regional differences with your region. In the European Union, the composition is mostly paper and cardboard packaging, followed by plastic and glass, with then wood packaging and metal as smaller component. But what was interesting in trying to tackle the growth of packaging waste was to look at which were the streams, the packaging streams that were growing the fastest. And these were and are plastic packaging and paper and cardboard packaging. Another element which really required a rethinking of the European Union approach to deal with packaging waste was the fact that despite a lot of effort, both regulatory but also from businesses, in terms of recycling and fixing the recycling system, in fact, recycling rates for packaging in the European Union has been stagnating since 2010. So showing the need to actually tap into the higher steps of the waste hierarchy, such as prevention and reuse. Another, maybe the last elements in terms of the environmental crisis that this problem was posing was the fact that in the European Union, the packaging sector is responsible for almost 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent. This is more or less equivalent to the annual emission of a country like Hungary. And also packaging is a major driver of resource use. In Europe, 40% of all plastic and 50% of all paper is used only for packaging and primarily single-use packaging. So this was just to show the starting point for this regulation, which was a state where it was very clear that this sector was absolutely incompatible with the climate neutrality ambition of the European Union, and that there was an urgent need to address emissions, but also resource use in this sector. Next slide, please. And before looking at the main elements of the regulation, perhaps just a reflection on the evolution of the way the European Union has dealt with packaging waste. So the first time that the Union has introduced rules on packaging waste was in 1994, and the rules were reviewed a few times since then. The problem was that the regulatory focus remained really limited on waste management and recycling. So to trying to deal with the problem once that had already happened. In addition to this, there were a number of evident regulatory failure of the EU rules, primarily the fact that there was very poor enforcement of the existing rules, but also some of the rules to minimize packaging were poorly designed or poorly defined. So it was very difficult to spot cases of overpackaging. Even the most obvious cases of overpackaging would not be prohibited under the previous rules. And so in November 2022, the European Commission published a proposal to update the European Union rules and proposing to move from a directive, which is an EU instrument that sets target, which then requiring the national governments to transpose and adopt the measures to reach those targets, to a regulation. A regulation is an instrument which is directly applicable to all the economic operators that are entering the market of the Union. And then finally, in beginning of this year, the packaging regulation finally entered into force after the usual process of legislative process and the regulation. And for the first time, the EU has put forward very concrete prevention and reuse measures that we're going to discuss together. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is just to present you the EU packaging waste regulation and its main objective. So this regulation is actually setting rules for the entire packaging life cycle. So from the moment that the packaging is designed all the way to when it becomes waste and needs to be handled by recyclers. And the scope, it's all packaging. So not just household packaging, but also commercial, industrial, transport, and other sectors. And also you have to imagine all materials. The top lines objectives that the European Commission had when launched this regulation were a commitment to make all the packaging in the European Union reusable or recyclable by 2030, to improve the rules for packaging, to make sure the packaging actually gets reused and recycled, also to boost the uptake of recycled content in plastic packaging as a way to fix a broken plastic recycling value chain. And then, of course, to tackle the most obvious forms of overpackaging with the objective to reduce overall packaging waste generation. Another objective was to make sure that the new rules were actually enforceable and implemented in practice. Next slide, please. And this slide is indeed full of words, so don't be scared because we're going to go into each of that measures individually, but it's just to give you an overview of the key elements of this regulation. And the first one, most important, is the introduction of binding reduction targets for member states, which will have to reduce the amount of packaging waste that is generated in their country. And this is supported then. This is a top line objective, which is supported by a number of very concrete measures to enable countries to achieve this target. And the first one is restriction for some single-use packaging items which are unnecessary or avoidable. And there's a number of formats that are not necessary and a number of formats that can be substituted easily with reusable solutions. Then there's also rules to minimize packaging, such as maximum empty space ratio in packaging, and also the other measures that's supposed to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of waste prevention are the reuse targets. And the regulation introduced reuse targets for economic operators, so for the businesses that are placing packaging on the market on a number of sectors. The regulation also, as a key area of focus, recyclability and recycling, and we will see how the European Union has tried to make sure that recycling happens in practice and at scale in Europe. Then there's, as I mentioned, there's also recycled content target mandating the incorporation of a minimum component of recycled plastic in packaging, and a number of other measures that we're going to discuss. The last one I want to mention here already is the European Union also looked at the safety of packaging from a chemical perspective. So there is a restriction of PFAS in food packaging, and also a number of measures to monitor and restrict substances of concern in food packaging and packaging in general. Next slide, please. And here we start with an overview of the main elements of the regulation. And the first one is prevention, as I said. And the regulation sets a target for the member states, which will have to reduce the packaging waste that's generated per capita. And you see here the targets, they are growing targets all the way to minus 15% by 2040. And what is important and interesting in our opinion is the concrete measures that are behind this target that actually give a chance to reduce packaging to these proportions. And we're going to discuss most of them, but another element that is important is that additional to the supporting measures, also the member states, so these are the national governments inside the European Union, are also empowered and actually asked to adopt additional national waste prevention measures, which are additional to the one I'm going to describe in a moment. And that could include economic instruments, think about like taxation or fines or incentives, but also additional reuse target or reuse requirement. Next slide, please. Yeah, one of the measures to achieve this packaging waste reduction was to introduce stricter and clearer rules on packaging minimization, and also rules to minimize the void space in packaging. And you see here in the slide, some of these are detailed. For example, there was going to be a maximum limit to the empty space that you can have in group transport and e-commerce packaging. But also the rules are clearer in the sense that packaging that is not necessary to perform a key performance of packaging, they're called in the regulation key performance criteria. So for example, a packaging that is not needed to protect the product or to ensure hygiene and safety is no longer allowed in the EU market, and a number of reasons that before were legitimate reason to place packaging in the market, they no longer are. And that's, for example, packaging materials that are added just to increase consumer acceptance or just as a marketing tool. These are no longer going to be legitimate reasons to overpackage. And yes, as I mentioned, there's also clearer rules in terms of how much empty space there is within packaging. So of course, maintaining the role of product protection, but trying to reduce the material to the bare minimum that is necessary to perform the functions. Next slide, please. Yes, and this is perhaps the most innovative and also the most interesting element of the regulation is that the European Union finally kind of got concrete in terms of how to make sure that reusable packaging systems are implemented in Europe, because they are the most effective way for reducing packaging waste. And there is reuse targets that apply directly to economic operators, so not to member states that then need to implement them, but directly to the businesses operating in the European Union. And you see that these are growing targets. They start from a low percentage in 2030, and then they scale up in 2040. And the sectors that are covered by these reuse targets are the beverage sectors, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic, with some exemptions, for example, for wine. And then another sector that is clearly targeted by reuse targets is transport packaging and group packaging. Unfortunately, in these targets, there is an exclusion for cardboard boxes, which, as you can imagine, limits the transformative power of these targets, because a lot of transport and group packaging is indeed cardboard and paper. Another area where, of course, reuse can play a big role in waste prevention is food and beverages in a takeaway sector. So this is the restaurant sector takeaway. And here the European Union failed to adopt a binding target, but there's nevertheless a number of measures that are supposed to incentivize also reuse in this space. So, for example, an obligation for businesses, for restaurants to accept refillable packaging that is brought by the consumers, and then an aspirational target that is non-binding to implement reuse systems, and for large supermarkets to achieve a 10% of sales in reuse. And I imagine there could be more questions on the reuse target, and I'm happy that Fernando is also here with us to help us with those, and we can take them later. Next slide. Yeah, in addition to the reuse target, waste prevention will also be facilitated by restrictions on some formats that you see in the slides, which have been identified as evidently unnecessary or avoidable. And these are primarily single-use plastic packaging formats, and these bans will apply from 2030. Of course, with some exemptions that relate again to the safety and the possibility for member states to exempt some of these formats. And you see, for example, there is plastic wraps on fruits and vegetables, but also the miniature packaging for hotels, and also single-use plastics in the restaurant when you are consuming food within a restaurant. Next slide, please. We move now to the other element of the regulation, which is recycling and recyclability. And the European Union, with this regulation, puts in practice this commitment of having all packaging recyclable by 2030. And the notion of recyclability is defined in two steps. So first of all the packaging that's placed on the Union market has to be designed for recycling. And this is, I would say, recyclability in theory, and that is mandatory by 2030. By 2035, the packaging will not just have to be designed for recycling, but it will need to prove recyclability at scale in the territory of the European Union. And this two-steps approach is important because it tries to reduce this gap between recyclability in theory and recycling in practice. Yeah, I want to stress, because here we're also looking at the implication for other markets, is that recyclability therefore becomes a market access condition. And if a packaging doesn't meet a certain recyclability threshold, it will not be allowed to be placed on the market. The methodologies for defining the recycling rules and the methodology to assess recyclability at scale will still have to be defined by the European Commission, which will do so in secondary legislation. Next slide, please. So this is the point of recycled content is very connected to the recyclability, because it focuses on a material which faces the most problem in terms of circularity, which is plastic. And so the European Union is requiring packaging producers to incorporate a minimum percentage of recycled plastic in their packaging. And here as well, the targets are growing with a lower target in 2030 and a higher target in 2040, and they are differentiated considering the application. So for plastic beverage bottles, where actually we already have recycled content targets, they are higher, but you see there's minimum targets also for contact sensitive plastic packaging and also for any other plastic packaging. Yeah, and there is of course some exemptions, mostly for medicinal product and medical devices, but also for cases where the plastic component is less than 5% of the total weight of the packaging. Next slide, please. Another measures that is supposed to step up to contribute to really increase recycling of packaging in the European Union is the obligation for the member states to establish deposit and return systems. And these are systems in which when you buy a packaging, you're also paying a deposit that then is given back to you once you returned the empty bottle in this case. And this will be mandatory for plastic bottles and for metal cans. And it is a way to actually support the circularity of these packaging formats and to make sure that the collection rates are really higher, closer to 90%, where the systems have been implemented. Another objective of the European Union was to bring some harmonization in the labeling, and the labeling both of the packaging in terms of the instructions, the material composition and how it has to be disposed, separately collected, but also harmonizing the waste bins, the waste receptacles, so that across the union the instructions are clear also for consumers in how to make sure it gets recycled in the right way. Moving to the next slide, please. Yes, this is the last point, is what this regulation has done in terms of protecting the consumer's health and safety. There were also, and there are also, issues with the safety and contamination from packaging and food packaging. And one measure, perhaps the most important, is a restriction of PFAS from food packaging, which will be effective already from the start of the regulation. And then there's a series of measures that are supposed to improve the knowledge about the chemicals composition of packaging and the possible risks, and also give authorities the possibility to adopt further measures to protect consumers' health and safety in relation to substances of concerns. And I will be closing with the next slide, which is just meant to give food for thought for our next discussion. Next slide, please. We're gonna, sorry, there's still one, but I will be very quick about this. The extended producer responsibility regimes. Well, this regulation is a system in which the packaging producers are paying a fee when a packaging enters the market, and this fee is supposed to help cover the cost of collection and recycling. It's a way to implement the polluter pays principle. And what this regulation does is to marginally strengthen this regime, making producer responsible for covering more costs. Also, possibly member states might decide to include the cost of cleaning up packaging litter, which is a major cost. And interestingly, there's also a measure which is called, we call it Fund for Change. So it's asking EPR schemes to dedicate a certain share of their budget to financing reduction and prevention actions. You have to imagine that at the moment, these systems are financing only partially collection and recycling. So it is important also in terms of how we bring financial resources to the reuse economy and to waste prevention. Next slide, please. This time for real, it is my last slide, and it's really meant just to give some reflection on the process and possible inputs for the discussion. So when we look at the EU packaging regulation, of course, there's some very important drivers for change, drivers for circularity in the packaging sector, which is prevention and reuse targets. And this provide a credible, a concrete solution to the packaging waste crisis. And by introducing them, the European Union also recognizes that recycling alone, it's insufficient to reduce the material and our carbon footprint at the scale and at the speed that we need to in order to achieve climate and environmental goals. So finally, there's concrete measures also in the higher steps, prevention and reuse, which give us a concrete chance at reducing packaging waste. And as we will hear, well-designed reuse systems, they can reduce waste, and they reduce waste at source. They can cut energy and emissions, as well as resource and water use. And of course, they also offer opportunities for jobs and business growth. There's also some remaining gaps in this EU policy when we look at this regulation and when we look at the process that led to its adoption, which is mostly the most concerning ones are a whole series of exemptions and derogations to these rules that I just detailed that were adopted under the pressure of massive lobbying from single-use packaging producers and users. And I only single out the three main here in the slide. One is the exclusion of paper and cardboard packaging from the reuse targets from transport, which really reduces the transformative potential of these measures. There's also in the regulation loopholes for paper-based single-use packaging, mostly for food, which then risks driving some perverse material substitution because you can imagine that the objective wherever is possible should be prevention and reuse and not just to substitute single-use plastic packaging with single-use paper packaging coated in plastics, which is a little bit of the risk that we see with these loopholes. And then finally, the EU failed in adopting reusable targets for takeaway food and drinks. And I close here just to say that then we have some very important drivers for change and some very ambitious measures. And of course, the success will depend in Europe, at least, from successful implementation and enforcement of these rules. And thanks a lot for the attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Marco, for this presentation. And now we will dive into the panel discussion. I'll present briefly the speakers of this panel. While I present, Marco, I will invite you to have a look at a question in the Q&A. There's one in the Q&A, one in the chat. You can think about them if you think you have a good answer. One is quite technical. Which third-party certifications or schemes are commonly accepted or recognized by EU regulators as proof of recycled content? So if you'd like to answer that in the chat, you're welcome to. And one is broader and very interesting, and we may dive into it in the panel discussion. I see it. For EPR to sustain, there shall be continuous flow of waste. If so, where do we implement the reduction principle? That's a deeper question. And now I'd like to introduce the panel. I'd like to welcome them. I'd like to welcome Mr. Fernando Rodriguez Mata, who is Director General of the New European Reuse Alliance. Since 2022, he has 10 years of experience in circular economy and packaging matters, including work in two public affairs firms in Brussels and Madrid. Welcome, Fernando. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. I'd also like to welcome Kun Wisarut Chali, who is, Mr. Wisarut is founder and CEO of Rewastek, is a startup established in 2021 that pioneers material innovation through plastic recycling and circular economy design. So Mr. Chali is a graduate in polymer engineering, and his company actually turns plastic and agricultural waste into value-added products. And Rewastic is also a business case that Switch Asia has studied, and I'll put the link very shortly in the chat. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Ioannis Antonopoulos, who is Policy Officer of DG Environment. Ioannis is a mechanical engineer by background with a PhD from Aristotle University in Greece, and previously to joining the DG Environment, so the Ministry of Environment of the European Commission, he undertook research in the Joint Research Center of the European Union. So welcome, Ioannis. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Mr. Anshu Singhal, who is founder of Karo Sambhav, which was created in 2017 and aims to make circular economy possible, specifically in India, which is a challenge. And Karo Sambhav has been creating grassroots ecosystems to set up a robust India-wide solution on collection, recycling, and secondary material management. So really the heart of the matter here, but in India. And previously, Mr. Singhal was the head of sustainability for Nokia, and he has been awarded many prizes in Europe and in Asia for his work. So thank you very much, everyone. I would like to start this webinar, this panel, by asking a question to Ioannis. So after this presentation by Marco, could you explain to us what is the long-term vision of this regulation? So you're really at the heart of it. You were probably designing articles of this regulation. And for you, what are the steps to reach this vision? So maybe to answer a little bit the question of this webinar, to find out whether this can be a source of inspiration for Asia or not, this regulation. And I'd also like to hear from you, what do you think the perception of this regulation is among businesses and legislators? And also maybe another question, which is of great interest to our Asian audience, what are the trade implications of this regulation? So Ioannis, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Elodie, and also good morning from Europe and good afternoon in Asia. I hope that you can hear me well. Thanks a lot for the very good introduction in the opening of the event, and also for the very good presentation overview of the packaging regulation by Marco. Very comprehensive and going into the details of this regulation. I will start with something that Marco mentioned in his slides, that this is the first piece of legislation, EU piece of legislation, that aims to regulates in fact the upper parts of the waste hierarchy, which is basically the prevention and reuse. So we come up with a concrete packaging waste reduction targets. These were presented in detail by Marco, but also reuse targets. But also there are some measures to promote reuse and refill practices in the EU. This I will also explain a little bit further, and adding up on the points that Marco made. But before going, let's say, into this more not technical, I will try to keep it at a general level, but more going into diving into these details. As a policy officer, I think Elodie mentioned that I'm one of the policy officers working in DG Environment, Unit B3 from Waste to Resources, in the development of, since the genesis of the proposal at the time, but now participating and in all the negotiations of the regulation, and now focusing on the implementation. With this role that I have, I can only emphasize on the value that this new regulation, the new packaging and packaging waste regulation has, because first, which will make packaging more sustainable, because the packaging regulation focuses now on the eco design, but also more resource efficient. Another dimension is also the harmonization, which basically businesses will gain a lot of efficiency, will have a lot of efficiency gains, and in fact, they have more legal certainty, they have a smoother practices, and they have more predictable trade. So this harmonization, these harmonized rules creates the level playing field, the necessary level playing field, because we had in the packaging sector a lot of different, we had a propagation of different national rules, national within the EU at least, but also outside the EU in third countries. We had propagation of different rules in terms of labeling, in terms of recyclability, recycled content. And by harmonizing all this, we are reducing basically the trade barriers in the European market at least. Also, this harmonization is also supported, was endorsed by several businesses in the EU at least, which basically also proves that this is very was necessary to go for regulation and to harmonize definitions, principles, and measures. I can assure you now that with all the Commission empowerments that we have, when I say empowerments, all the necessary secondary legislation, implementing act in the form of implementing and delegated acts, we try to ensure a smooth transition towards the new rules, trying to reconcile the environmental benefits with economic feasibility. Now in the team, we're working at full speed, if I can put it like this, towards the implementation of the new regulation. We have around 14, well, between 11 and 14 secondary legislation, this implementing and delegated acts, including a lot of guidelines to adopt within the next few years in order to create this legal certainty, to lay down all the necessary, to clarify rules in order, let's say, to ensure legal certainty for the business to take the strategic decisions that they want to do. As I mentioned, this regulation has put a lot of emphasis on eco-design. These are the concrete. This is something that there is the vision, one of the vision, on top of the other that also Marco mentioned and explained. Some concrete steps that we are trying now to make are, first of all, to establish the rules for the first step of the recyclability, which is the technical recyclability. Marco referred to recyclability in theory, but let's call it better technical recyclability, because this, first of all, will establish some harmonized rules for the packaging to be considered as recyclable in the EU, but also all packaging that will be placed on the market, including the imports by third countries, will need to comply with all the rules that will be developed in that delegated act to be developed and adopted by 2027. So that delegated act that will come in more or less 2-year time from now will be the reference point, not only in the EU, but also in the world, if you want, for packaging in order to be allowed to be placed on the market. Packaging which is not going to be compliant with this design for recycling rules will not be allowed to be placed on the European market. On top, there is another concrete step that, at least in the EU, such packaging which complies with the design for recycling rules will not be allowed to be incinerated or even landfilled. So this is just a concrete step, a concrete action to promote the recyclability, to promote circularity, but also to promote the circularity, but also to reduce as much as possible all different waste and other practices other than waste recycling. This gives us a lot of predictability to waste operators. With the design for recycling rules, there is also harmonization of the sorting and recycling techniques, so it gives a lot of predictability also for the waste part when the packaging becomes waste. Then on reuse, for instance, Marco gave a very good overview of all the targets, the necessity to have a reuse and refill system, but there is another element which goes beyond. There is the EU observatory, which we need to establish in the next few years. And this role, and the role of the EU observatory will be, first of all, of course, to check and monitor what happens on the ground in terms of reuse and refill, so how the companies report, but not to check compliance, but also to understand what is happening on the ground, the evolution of these reuse and refill targets, because it is quite also important. But then the other important role will be to put together to learn from these best practices that happen on reuse, and to try to promote, to stimulate the reuse. And the EU Observatory, who have the 2030 targets, but there are also the 2040 targets, where we need also to understand what happens on the ground, and then to try to amend them, meaning to increase the targets probably, or to expand the scope. All this, the EU Observatory will also contribute to these discussions that will happen in the future. So it's an important also element of reuse. So this gives also the spirit and this long-term vision that we have in the Commission to try to see and to develop, to come up with this systemic change in the packaging sector to make packaging more circular. So all these elements, as also Marco explained in his presentation, the new packaging regulation is considering all different life cycle stages of the packaging, from the production until the waste phase. So we try to foster collaboration between all these actors of the packaging, but also to put together governments, businesses, and consumers. And we think that by working together, we will ensure that the circular economy becomes a reality. In terms of the implementation of the regulation, as I said, we're working at full speed to make this happen. We have together with us the Joint Research Center, which is basically the research organization. It's an independent research organization within the European Commission, where they have concrete tasks to assist us on recyclability, on labeling, for instance. And this is something that has already started happening, but we will also have some other possibly external support for other various pieces of the legislation. In terms of how the regulation affects businesses and how other organizations located in third countries like Asia, for instance, yes, since the genesis of the proposal, meaning quite many years ago, we were in close contact, we were discussing how we think, how we were thinking to frame the new regulation. This dialogue continued during the negotiations of the proposal of the packaging regulation, but now we will also continue on being and exchanging with our partners in third countries to understand and to give the context, to clarify rules, to clarify questions. So we are in close contact with them to give some clarity on the new rules. We have on the webinar that we organized in December, just the day that the regulation was adopted, was on 16th of December 2024. Just to tell you that we had a webinar where we tried to clarify some questions from our side. It was the team interpretation at the time, where the webinar gathered a lot of attention. We had about 8,000 of participants, and this, which was basically the participants were around the globe, and this also gives the importance of this new piece of regulation and how well the systemic changes that brings this regulation. In terms of the trade implication that the new regulation can cause, basically, I could think now two main consequences. First of all, we have the so-called equivalence, which is under Article 7 on recycled content. And then we have also the positive effect that I also mentioned before of the harmonization on businesses. So the harmonization meaning that we have now new definitions, new rules that are applying that will apply the same across the globe for all economic operators. In terms of this mirror clause and this equivalence, we will ensure that the recycled plastic that comes from third countries has to comply with the mandatory recycled content requirements in plastic packaging. It needs to comply, or basically it needs to be sourced in conditions that meet EU standards in order to create the level playing field. Level playing field among recyclates that we derive from EU sourced post-consumer plastic waste and that of non-EU origin. And this equivalence clause is necessary to protect the environment and all the investments made in the waste management sector, at least in Europe. We have also certain delegated acts to clarify all the rules, how the equivalence will be expressed in this delegated act, which needs to be adopted by the end of 2026. However, we need also to take into account the administrative burden. Probably such clauses might lead to some excessive administrative burden, which we need also to consider how to make it to be practical, operational, and also to deliver the benefits, to deliver exactly what we want to deliver. Yes, and one more word about the harmonization. The harmonized rules, of course, will benefit also the EU external partners, because the external partners so far probably they will have to comply with a patchy landscape, meaning different conditions, different requirements by different country. Now they will have only one rule for the entire EU. So this is a very good benefit, I think, for the ASEAN businesses, which is a consequence of this new regulation. Thanks for all this, but I'm available for any question if you may have.
Thank you so much, Ioannis. Thank you for this comprehensive answer. And maybe I think you may have answered one of the questions that we received from Kazakhstan on asking why is plastic recycling now seen as the foundation of a circular economy? Well, what I hear from you, Ioannis, is that actually it's more eco-design and prevention from the source that is what you envisage in the circular economy, and harmonization. It's not recycling for you. That is the last resort, absolutely to be avoided if possible, because it's difficult to recycle things. And also whatever should be recycled, you want to ensure that they can be recycled. That also I gather from your intervention. And I hope that answers the question from the CSD Center in Kazakhstan. But
if I have
Ioannis,
a very quick reaction.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. But we might
problem.
come back to you also at the end. Yeah, please do.
Few seconds. We're trying to respect to the neutrality for all materials. So the packaging reduction, the packaging regulation has some concrete packaging waste reduction targets. Plus is basically designed for recycling requirements, criteria for all different types of packaging. So it's not there is no any preference between plastic, metal, or even paper. But then, I mean, I'm also happy to take more questions or to elaborate further if needed.
Yeah, the reduction is important as well. Thank you, Ioannis. And now also on this topic of not recycling, I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Fernando Rodriguez Mata and to ask you a similar question, Fernando, about what for you is the long-term vision of this regulation, but also to hear from you about circular practices that you are already witnessing, probably more in Europe, but also possibly in Asia, that will help fit into global value chains. Thank you, Fernando. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Elodie. I'm very happy, to hear Ioannis on behalf of the European Commission to have this, clear roadmap. Indeed, the PPWR, the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, has set a clear direction towards more circularity in packaging in Europe. We know as well that Europe usually sets the standards, environmentally speaking, for the rest of the world, and many other regions follow. And we believe that this regulation is we have welcomed it as a reuse organization, representing businesses that provide these circular packaging systems across Europe, as it's basically paving the way for more circularity, for more reuse in the next years. Of course, there is still things to be polished and to be clarified further. As Ioannis said, there are quite a few secondary legislation, so upcoming new acts that will somehow enable the conditions and the implementing acts that will help member states to introduce the right conditions to implement all these measures. We think that reuse needs to be put at the forefront with prevention and reduction, because we have seen the curve of packaging waste, as Marco said, kept increasing. And recycling, of course, it may be one of the toolbox in the solution, but it is below in the pyramid and the waste hierarchy of reduction and reuse. So there has been a lot of focus on recycling over the last decades in Europe. It is the first time over 30 years since the first packaging and packaging waste directive that was adopted in Europe that EU legislation has put the focus on reuse. So I think that will help a lot of businesses to start looking more seriously into how to implement reuse practices within their models. Already, this is happening in Europe, and it has been happening for decades in some sectors like transport packaging. For pallets and plastic crates, we have been, many companies have been using this reusable transport packaging since the 90s. The thing is, there is an economic incentive for that, in the sense that these models are competitive and can compete with single-use packaging, but still in consumer packaging applications, there is not a level playing field, as single-use packaging typically externalize some of its end-of-life cost to all of us, because in local budgets, the sorting of waste and the treatment to be sent to recycling is not only covered by EPR. The reality is EPR fees cover part of that, but in public municipal bins, we still receive a lot of packaging, and that's basically all taxpayers that are contributing to that. So there has to be some fiscal incentives and fiscal measures to level the playing field. We are seeing in Europe different measures, like in Spain, we have a tax on single-use non-recycled plastic packaging. Now, municipal cities in Germany, some cities in Germany are also establishing a tax on single-use packaging for takeaway. So we see there are more and more realization about what is the future, that we cannot recycle our way with all these waste we produce in Europe, and we believe it's similar in Asia. I'm aware that there are also reuse players appearing in Asia. There's a Asia Reuse Consortium that was recently created, bringing together different reuse operators and stakeholders interested in reuse, similar to New Era in Europe. And we are also trying to see what is the relation on how we can work together to make reuse the norm in the next years. That's our quest, and absolutely reuse will be there, will definitely grow as a way to reduce packaging waste. And if we are working towards the well design of the systems, keeping them environmentally sensible while economically feasible. And obviously we need to keep working with the Commission and all the different stakeholders at regional, local level to ensure that the systems are well put in place with our expertise and all the operators that we represent. We think that reuse needs to be way more present in our daily lives, not only for transport packaging, but for retail, for takeaway, for e-commerce. As our lifestyles have changed, we also need to somehow adapt with more circular packaging practices, so we reduce the pressure that we are putting on the resource extraction in our planet. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take maybe more questions in the next minutes.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Thank you for that. And yes, the importance of reuse. And I am very happy to hear that you're working with Asian civil society actors to define together reuse norms. That's very encouraging, because obviously there are trade exchanges between the two continents. So it's very important that the dialogue is there. And now I'd like to pass the floor to the founder of Rewastic, Mr. Wisarut Chali, and for him to explain to us more about how companies in Asia are already adopting circular practices, and maybe for him to explain a little bit more about his company and his business case.
Okay. Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Wisarut Chali. Okay, CEO at Livertech. Let me share my slide. Just a minute. Okay. 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 Livertech is startup company in Thailand for that sustainable packaging recycled plastic with agricultural waste mixed plastic waste such as Lysol, coffee ground, bamboo leaf. Yes, we focus turning plastic waste into high quality product from plastic waste. Yes, our works as such selected a case study in a composite material from agricultural waste and plastic recycling project. Its series is part of the Sweet Asia program. Yes. Okay. Okay. In Thailand, in the problem is climate change is plastic waste 2.9 billion ton plastic waste in the world into recycle system. More often landfill or the environment. Its pollution is climate change. Okay. Okay, this is Rivertech. Rivertech is just a collect waste by hospital, university, factory, or local mixed agricultural waste, or by agricultural waste, or Lysol. Is Rivertech in one-stop service. We collect plastic waste from hospital. We also sort agricultural waste from farming. After cleaning and cleaning, we process but material touch extrusion, twin screw extrusion, and create recycle plastic pellets. Yes, they are then used to make plastic with bigger and sustainable product. Maybe of its products of local community. Yes, my product Rivertech is particular and plastic wicker PCR composite for sustainable. My product is plastic waste PC PC, PVC, PET, and LDPE, HDPE for mixed agricultural waste like soil, coffee cob, bamboo leaf. Yes. Okay. Property. Plastic puree is strong and sustainable and eco-friendly and reduce carbon and natural friendly and okay. It's Duratec is make natural fiber to agricultural waste. It's made the scale of fiber inhibit composites in nanosize of carbon nanosize microsize is a big my Duratec. Yeah. Okay. Now Duratec is recycle formula PET recycle, HDPE recycle, LDPE recycle. Yes. Okay. Competitive. Okay. Our recycle LDPE recycle composite. Our outperform virgin LDPE assets are the most higher tensile and fracture strength, better has resistance and lower carbon industry. Yes. Okay, they will take my platform is Rivertech is data process hiring consultant carbon footprint. Yes, it's by but sustain it's not just about material, it's also about data. Today calculating carbon footprint is slow, manual and expensive. Yes, it's 90 carbon report are reduced error and the process take our 90 days. Yes. Okay. We saw this is Rivertech is redefines carbon work. It's our carbon data platform. It's automates document reading, calculate emission, and generates audit ready to report to one click or in command with GHG protocol, TGO, GI, and ISO standard. Yeah. Okay, we will take in action our platform do one end-to-end component. Yes, end-to-end component from raw data certified reports is ready to submit to organization like HCS or TGO in just minute. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. 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 It's Rivertech is no carbon emission request. You upload my initial and Rivertech ask care to cultural mapping to carbon footprint. Yes. Okay. Rivertech contributing to sustainability to an environment impacts now. Okay. Yes, living community reduce pollution and reduce burning to agricultural waste and reduce plastic waste and help environment reduce greenhouse gas emission from reduce and burning agricultural waste and recycle plastic. Yeah. But maybe economic repulsive to create job 10 people. Okay, leave it take. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Wisarut, for this presentation. Myself, living in Laos, where we suffer a lot from air pollution due to burning of agricultural waste at a certain time of the year, I welcome this greatly because it's a big issue in the region in northern Thailand and Laos and Myanmar. So yes, that not only the reuse of the packaging, but also what goes into the next packaging is thought of smartly is a great benefit to Asia, to the region. So thank you very much for that. And on this, I'd like now to pass the floor to our last speaker, Mr. Pranshu Singhal. And Pranshu, I'd like to ask you as well of your vision of how companies are already adopting circular practices in the region and Europe. And also, if you could help us understand better what investments are needed today for the Asia Pacific to adapt to the requirements of the packaging regulation in a few years, because 2030 is not so far away if you're planning to change your whole business to adapt to it. So, Pranshu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I will actually talk more from an Asia viewpoint rather than Europe. That's where I can give more experiences. So in terms of what we are seeing at a grassroots level, the first thing is, just to point out for all the readers, India has implemented EPR-based regulations, and the region at a Asia level is also now starting to look at and implement such regulations. So certain changes which have started to happen very clearly at a grassroots level. First, we are starting to see certain types of collection systems, being set up at a grassroots level. So there are now clear pathways on how to set up collection systems. They are still a bit, if I were to say, unorganized, but the good thing is that pathway of collection has started. A second thing that we are starting to see is high quality infrastructure plants, especially in the plastics packaging. When we talk of PET material, when we talk of single type of materials, not multi-layered materials, we are starting to see good recycling infrastructure being put. So, and this is supported in two ways. One is there is investment interest from regular investors in this space, considering that there will be offtake contracts signed for this material. And third, it is also hugely supported by brands now, because they are starting to sign offtake contracts and give long-term business continuity, or show the pathway of business continuity to the recycler. So we are seeing movement both in terms of collection, recycling, and uptake of material. Now, is this enough? Yet to be seen, but at least that journey has started. A second thing that is starting to emerge is, a speaker before me talked a lot about harmonization. We are starting to see harmonized thinking. Can we look at similar standards instead of, following very isolated approaches? So, that dialogue is starting to pick up very strongly. And most importantly, what we are also seeing is technical specifications being defined for recycled content, at least in food grade packaging. We are starting to see that. So there is a good maturity which is starting to emerge at a grassroots level. I can always question the speed at which it is happening, but one can always find ways of improvement. But at least there is a good movement which is out there. Second, from a design perspective, one of the changes that we are starting to see is certain companies are starting to eliminate use of plastics in packaging altogether, primarily because it allows for saving certain compliance costs. So the main reason for this change is a new compliance burden or compliance costs, which are now being added to their operational costs. So we are seeing many companies who are starting to eliminate this material, again, which is a very, very welcome change, something that has, that's very desirable, but has not been done at the pace that we were all looking forward to. The second question that you were asking, what kind of investments are needed? I think we need billions of dollars of investments in this space to reach the desired result. My first, point here would be, how do we make sure that each and every person out there who is getting their products in this packaging is able to participate in collection? So today, most people do not have access to these collection channels because largely municipalities are doing this collection. So we need a whole range of new types of collection systems, whether it is via retail, whether it is at home to home. But we need a completely new set of collection systems where investment is needed if we are to solve this problem. Today, that investment is very little. So we need to grow that investment significantly. A second type of investment is on the quality recycling infrastructure, really high quality recycling. While there are certain green spaces where this is happening, like PET recycling has grown significantly. We are seeing similarly for HDPE, for polystyrene, but at a whole level across, especially, multi-layer plastics, multi-layered packaging materials, this is yet to be seen. So for me, collection and high quality recycling infrastructure remain as the most important points for investment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pranshu. And it's very encouraging to see the movement that is starting in your subcontinent in India and probably wider. But also there is a great need for further investments. I hear you. We've had a few questions in the chat, and there was a number of questions, 2 of them, I think, more related to how will this actually be implemented? How will implementation work in practice? And it is a worry in I know in many Asian countries to they may have the policies, but to make them work is not easy. So maybe Ioannis, you could enlighten us on that, and how will this regulation trickle down and be implemented?
Yes, thank you, Elodie, of course, and thanks for the questions to the audience. Of course, I can try to explain a little bit more. As I mentioned, this well, with this situation now, we go from a directive to a regulation. That means that economic operators who make packaging available in the market, in the EU market, or who place on the EU market packaging, should be responsible and should be compliant with the new rules. So in the EU, we call them market surveillance authorities, which are basically authorities which are located usually in customs. They will take all the rules that will implement in the form of implementing anti-delegated acts, and then they will apply, they will be checking compliance of the imported goods, either empty packaging or stuff in packaging, whether these goods or the empty packaging complies with the rules outlined in this secondary legislation. This is one thing, and of course the regulation includes all the rules what will happen in non-compliance. Just to be sure that if customs realize no compliance, then this packaging will not be allowed to place on the market. So there is massive. So this regulation and non-compliance might have massive implications in the economy, in the respective sectors. Just to give one example, because that question I think I screened in the chat is also asks about the PROs and the EPRs role. If I can give one specific illustrative example on recyclability, since we also spoke a lot about recyclability in the previous, all the previous speakers, we said something about recyclability. So the system that we have conceived and now applies in the regulation, it's a so-called traffic light system. So every packaging which needs to comply with the design for recycling criteria will get a score, which then will be translated into some grades, grade A, grade B, C, and D. The D will not be available to be placed on the market. This is going to be the red category. But for all the others, which will be allowed to be placed on the market, starting from A, which is the fully recyclable, and going to C, which is the least recyclable, but still recyclable, or to say it differently, which has a bit of limited recyclability, the EPR fees will be modulated in accordance with the acquired grade, meaning that a packaging which scores very high in recyclability and gets the grade A, the green, the fully, and then it is demonstrated the full recyclability, the EPR fees that the economic operator will have to pay will be lower compared to a packaging which scores very low in terms of recyclability, gets this grade C, still allowed to be placed on the market, but the recyclability is limited. And this is an example where basically the EPRs in Europe, they will have also to promote, because we were speaking about promote the recyclability. So these are, as I'm trying to explain before in my speech, that there is a coordination of the different actors in the packaging. So market surveillance authorities for checking compliance, but also the EPR schemes, also in the EU, to check to promote where they have the right to do so. They have the empowerment, like recyclability, to promote these green practices.
Thank you so much, Ioannis. And maybe there's another question. I might ask this one to Marco, because I think you can add also some elements of how you see this rolling out, Marco, and maybe add some thoughts on other discussions we've had. Will there be phases in this enforcement, and how will this happen, be rolled out? Because I can imagine that in some countries in Europe there may be a lot of infrastructure, a lot of things happening for reuse, whereas in others it's maybe a bit new. So and this diversity of Europe can be also interesting to hear from in Asia. So Marco?
Yes, thanks for the questions. I'll try to answer, also though I'm conscious that it's probably the European Commission best place for this. But so the diversity of Europe is beautiful, like the diversity in general, as long as it's not an excuse to be laggards in how we manage packaging waste. So the first rule in Europe were from 1994, that's 30 years ago. And indeed, there is massive differences between EU countries in the level of collection and recycling. But now at this point with the regulation that's supposed to be directly applicable, this hopefully leaves less room for this type of excuse or for this type of delay. So finally, with EU harmonized definition of recyclability and recycling at scale, the intention, and certainly we hope that will happen, is that we can also ensure harmonization between member states. So, of course, there's different starting point. Globally, for Europe, for packaging waste, this is a little less viable as an excuse for inaction. In terms of compliance for example, the recyclability as a market access condition, well, Ioannis has just explained how this will work. So it will be gradual in the sense that the definition and the recyclability score, A, B, C, will hopefully be dynamic and follow the evolution of innovation in that space, and also push for a positive dynamic where packaging will become more and more recyclable. At the same time, there is also the need to be clear on the rules and also at which point which type of packaging will no longer be accepted, just so that you can have the carrot and the stick in this regulation. If I may to jump in, because there were a lot of questions in the chat about extended producer responsibilities and PRO, and I was very happy to actually read some critical reflection on this instrument, because this is perhaps well, a lesson learned or a source of inspiration from European Union to the Asia region, which is to leapfrog and also learn from some of the mistakes or some of the weaknesses in the European Union approach to packaging. The idea being that it doesn't, hopefully will have to take 30 years to realize that if you only focus on collection and recycling and you do absolutely nothing from a regulatory perspective on reuse and prevention, the problem will not be solved. And the same applies to EPR, where there is a philosophy behind EPR of implementing the polluter pays principle, but then there's been a practical implementation, certainly in Europe, which has been super narrow and only focused on collection and recycling, which now brings to EPR that have been unable to promote eco-design and unable to scale up towards prevention and reuse. And actually in the European Union context, unfortunately, some of these PROs have defended the interest of indeed the recycling value chain, so the interest to have growing amounts of packaging waste. So I think there's some lessons to be learned also in terms of leapfrogging directly to a circular economy that's very clear on the principle, that's very clear on the priorities, and that prevention comes first and then reuse and then recycling. And in this sense, yeah, the European Union, we said, it can be a standard setter, but we can also learn from the clear mistakes that were made in addressing packaging waste in Europe, which now lead to Europe having this type of packaging waste crisis.
Thank you, Marco. And I've been putting in the chat a brief of Switch Asia on the importance of design in EPR. So think before you collect, so you can collect the right things. And I'll also be putting a brief specific to Kazakhstan, but we've covered other countries. I might not have the time to put all the links, but there was a question about our work in Central Asia, so it's EPR in Kazakhstan for those who are interested, but we also worked in Thailand, Malaysia, and I forget, Pranshu will know which other countries, or Zenaida. So yes, thank you very much. I'd like to ask maybe, Fernando, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share after this discussion?
Yes,
after hearing
thank you,
also
Elodie.
from our Asian colleagues, how the world is changing all around us.
Indeed, maybe just to react on the last comment from Marco, and indeed a lot of questions on EPR and how we can basically balance this approach between EPR systems, the producer responsibility organizations, having been created to collect and recycle. So basically they depend on the fees they receive from the packaging companies placing on the market. And now this new systemic approach that we are transforming in Europe, and indeed, hopefully in the other regions in the world, they will not look in how we started introducing this back in the 90s, is that we focus first on the prevention and the reuse. The PPWR says now that EPR systems and deposit return systems need to invest a minimum share of their budget into prevention and reuse. I mean, it doesn't say reuse, but it says prevention and reduction of waste. It is time indeed that the EPR systems try to see how we can reduce the packaging waste. And obviously there is a bit of a conflict of interest, because the more packaging that is placed on the market, the more fees and the more budget they have. So indeed, I think the PROs are now, at least in Europe, are thinking what does the future look like for us? And I think there is a very nice example in France by law. All PROs need to invest a minimum 5% of the budget into development of reuse. And in France, in next 2 weeks, there's going to be a launching, I would say, the largest scale project for reuse systems at the retail setting. More than 33 million reusable containers on standardized glass packaging for beverages and some other food products will be placed in North and West regions, covering 16 million inhabitants. And many reuse believers and enthusiasts and stakeholders are looking into what's happening in France, because it's going to show us the way to how we can scale up reuse in consumer packaging applications in supermarkets and so on. So very interesting, a large-scale project that is going to happen very soon in France. And definitely the EPR systems need to be transformed in Europe to help reuse become what we want, the standard.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Thank you to all the panelists for your inputs. I could continue with more questions, and I'm sure you could continue bringing more insights, but we're reaching the end of the webinar, so I'd like to invite our team leader, Dr. Fadeva, to close this webinar with her reflections on all the discussions.
Thank you, colleagues. And in closing, this is important to emphasize that the packaging regulation grounded clearly, as we said, in the systemic circular approach, which is going far beyond recycling. This is multiple time emphasized, and this is the discussion which we consistently carry on while we work again in our 42 countries in Asia and the Pacific and the Middle East with the government and with the business associations. At its core, it's about prevention and reduction, focusing upstream on product design, material choice, and also on measures that avoid waste before it arises, whether it goes through this regulation or through EPR. What stood out in today's exchange is the collective recognition that the journey towards the current state of regulation and practice in the EU, to start with, was neither quick nor easy. Important insights shared today remind us that while challenges remain, there is a clear and ambitious vision for this transformation. And we are moving to the right direction with lots of negotiations. So that is quite important for us and for this discussion to follow up, to see this little pitfalls and big pitfalls and discussions ahead. We were particularly pleased to hear from businesses today that they're bringing plastics back to the supply chain, showcasing technological innovation that make this possible. And what is interesting at the same time, it is evident that one of the biggest areas of work lies, you saw the slides, in the data collection, in transparency, and in verification. And very often, and we know from other cases and discussions we're carrying on, Elodie, just yesterday we were speaking about this in the context of Lao, the verification and certification that some of the materials taken from wasteful plastic need these authorities or verifiers, and in some cases we don't have those. So how to deal with this very evidently simple but very difficult case? So only with robust system can we ensure trust and scalability, and also movement of materials to the European market in this particular case. Also, the business exchange with our business colleagues show that many of the solutions which are discussed today and practiced by the businesses addressing multiple challenges at once. Well, these interesting palettes are addressing the climate change. At the same time, air pollution, as Lodi, you mentioned, is a big problem in our region, and also waste reduction. So these integrated approaches are critical, and very interesting solutions are there. So across the South Pacific region, we also see encouraging signs of system thinking in action, efforts to eliminate harmful or suboptimal materials, to introduce requirements on recycled content, and to consider the perspective of brand owners. So brand owners now are becoming more active, or if not more active, at least staying at the course. Pranshu has been speaking about this. Yet, as you, Pranshu, mentioned, it's equally clear that speed of transformation must accelerate, and greater investment is urgently needed, particularly in the collection system and recycled infrastructure. We do know that quite a lot of APR organizations in the regions are very good or becoming very good and more advanced in collecting materials. But what happened with this material, particularly in the packaging area, is a big question. So moreover, beyond in other products. So let me also share a few personal highlights that stood out for me today. So first, the role of customs authorities was mentioned. Thank you very much for this. It's often overlooked or underemphasized players in the discussions on APR laws, regulations in the region here. And this is exactly the player which can ensure that only compliant and sustainable products flow across the borders. This is a powerful point. And it's really about intersection of regulation and enforcement. Second, interesting point for me personally is this insight and discussion about APR fees, which should be modulated based on product characteristics. It's clear incentive, which could be maybe practiced through APROs for better design and product responsibility. This is something which we are really trying to say in our project, which Elodie, you have mentioned on APR. It's not simply how to make APR system, this project of Switch Asia. It's really about how to make what other enabling conditions need to be there for APR system to manage not only resources and waste, but really to clearly send a signal to the producers that the products need to look differently, so that there is a incentive to design material and products so that there is incentive to take the product or materials back. So I would also like to note that here under the Switch Asia, this APR enabling factor technical advisory is covering Malaysia, the Philippines, Pakistan, Thailand, and also Kazakhstan, with the goal of strengthening policy frameworks that drive circularity from the outset. And third and final, I was struck by the emphasis on the recyclability that maintains material integrity through multiple cycles. Yes, this is also what we are bringing forward. And this points, this point tells us that not only just recycling, but in principle, the material longevity and product longevity, which would lead to slowing the loop, is at the core tenet of circular economy thinking here. So with this, thank you once again for your rich contribution. It was certainly above the average in terms of the points being forward. Let us continue to exchange, learn, and push forward with both urgency and ambition. Thank you very much. And again, quite a lot of materials which allow us to connect further beyond this webinar is there. And we also look forward to other webinars there on our website. And by the way, webinar on APR will be held across these 5 countries on the 30th of May. You will find this information on our website. Thank you very much for your time, colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay. I had a power cut. Okay.